Afternoon. As you know, today's meeting is it's a progress report really on where we are with taking a comprehensive look at the exactions program with an eye towards dissolution of the program eventually. Everything that you've been hearing on the stakeholder meeting calls over the past couple of months. So we'll be discussing, you'll be receiving a progress report today on those stakeholder meetings, as well as the comprehensive analysis that's been completed so far for the existing program, and there'll be an opportunity at the end after the presentation for us to hear from the stakeholders again with everybody in the room. So this is today's agenda. I'll go over the goal of the meeting. You just heard a little bit about that. You'll hear a scope overview as well. You'll hear about Task 1 findings, which again is an analysis of the existing program. You'll hear a little bit more about Task 2, which you were all involved in. That is the stakeholder coordination and facilitation that you all participated in. And then Task 3 is really what's next in this process, and that's an infrastructure development and implementation plan. And that's really where the rubber hits the road on this. That's the plan that will put forth a roadmap for how we dissolve the program and next steps. So again, today's goal is to share the feedback that we've received from stakeholders to date. You all had separate meetings with our team to discuss your input and provide concerns and so on about the program, but we wanted to use this forum to give you a kind of a comprehensive overview of what all that feedback was. You'll hear about the common themes and program challenges as well as specific constraints. And then again, we will be previewing that process moving forward for what the different approach may look like in the exaction areas and the expansion areas, really. So with that, I'd like to introduce Joe Herman with Stantec. Joe is leading the project team that has been conducting the analysis. I believe you met him and members of his team when you were on your stakeholder calls, and he will walk you through the rest of the presentation. Once we get through that, we'll open it up to questions for both the committee as well as the stakeholders, and then we'll receive public comment. Thank you.
I'm more of a walker and talker, so.
I didn't do it, Joe.
I guess I'll stand over here. As many of you are aware, Stantec, along with EHI and Salt River Engineering, were selected to kind of evaluate the existing exactions program, as well as kind of say, okay, take a deep dive, see what's worked, what hasn't worked, and then come up with a strategy to kind of get us across the finish line and dissolve the program. And so I'll give you just a real thumbnail scope overview, just so the vernacular, when I talk about Task 1, Task 2, Task 3, it makes sense to you. So Task 1 was that deep dive. That's where we just, they let us look at the records, and we went in there and took a look at, made our own conclusions by looking at all the information. And then once we kind of done that and took our notes and gleaned what we could, we went ahead and then met with you all, both the internal and external stakeholders, to, you guys are living the program, to hear firsthand what's worked for you and what hasn't worked, and what your specific issues were. And then, like Craig said, Task 3 is where we're really on the cusp of, and this is where we'll take all that information, kind of sequester ourselves, and try to navigate a path through that. So these are the expansion areas, so we're only talking about those ones that are highlighted, 1, 2, and 3. If you're here to talk about future expansion areas, that's a different meeting. And the numbers here on the left, these are a little bit dated, but they're close enough. They're from a presentation that LFUCG did in January of last year. But they should be close, and really the point here is just to know that each of these expansion areas are kind of in various different stages of development and kind of have their own unique characteristics, which you'll see when we see the feedback. That's pretty clear as well. So the Task 1 findings, we had a whole lot more than this, but I wanted to condense it down to one slide. So to just give you the ones that are kind of relevant to the discussion today, because there's a lot of other ones, but these are the ones that you'll see. We saw the same things, and then there's a lot of commonalities when we heard the feedback from you. So first and foremost is the program's not a typical approach by other communities. It's kind of almost unique. And a lot of other communities use an impact fee or something else. It does the same exact thing. It's just implemented a little bit differently. And again, the expansion areas are different from one another, both in the way they're made up as well as the progress of the way they've developed. The changes, and this is a real key one, the changes in zoning and the infrastructure costs impact those exaction fee calculations. And so that's important to note. I don't think it's anything earth-shattering there, but as you see the feedback, you'll kind of see where you got, how we got to where we were, or we are, excuse me. So some of these other ones, reconciliation, a lot of the developers chose to self-perform the infrastructure, and they estimate what those costs are, and then at the end they bring receipts. That wasn't always being done in a timely fashion, which has led to kind of delays in calculating things and understanding true costs. In some cases, when you do that, you get 80% of the credits up front. In some cases, there was use of more than that because maybe the cost varied from estimated for actual, and then there was instances of overspending. So that kind of got us through the task one, at least the ones relative today. So we met with, like I said, Craig, so I'm going to stand over on this side because I feel like I'm dancing on the edge right there. So we met with both the internal stakeholders, and here's, okay, what's your experience trying to administer this program? And then we also met with the external stakeholders, and you're on the other side of this. How does it work for you and whatnot? And so we're going to go over all that feedback, but we've broken it out into internal and external just to give it a little bit of a organization. So, and these are in no particular order. The first thing was the exaction areas program was designed so that the developing areas would be paid by new growth, and that it wouldn't be the existing ratepayers weren't paying for that the new people coming in would pay their way, so to speak. When the exactions program was submitted to council for approval in '96, there was also zoning that went along with it. And remember, we talked about, if you know, when the zoning changes or the infrastructure changes, it affects the cost. So they had kind of thought, back then they thought, well, we know that's going to happen. Let's get the zoning kind of nailed down so we can eliminate one of our variables. The zoning was not approved back then. So that's part of the reason we're seeing a lot of the dynamics or the flux in the program, is because every time there's a zoning change, it messes up the calculation. In addition, the program was really kind of thought, this thing will be over in 10 years, and here we are in 2021, and it's still going. And there's a lot of factors that contributed to that. And as a result, this time has given a lot of changes that were never envisioned or designed into the program. I think, Jim, you had mentioned that there's been like 5 comprehensive plan updates since this program was unveiled, and then the consent decree changed a lot of the way the sanitary infrastructure was envisioned back then. As well as other changes. In addition, this program is complex, has a very steep learning curve to really understand if you're trying to administer it. It's kind of difficult to communicate, and administer. And couple that with, over, as you can imagine, since 1996, people retire, people take different jobs, so a lot of staff turnover and a loss of that institutional knowledge and maybe some not so good record keeping in some instances have kind of led to it being even more challenging to administer. There was identified a need for systemic checks, so that way, hey, let's go ahead and check this every so often and make sure our numbers are right, so that way if an error is made, it detects early and it doesn't bleed on later and kind of upset the apple cart. And then the last thing was there's again, going back to the receipts, and we saw this too, is if in order to build the infrastructure, you have to estimate the costs, and that's what you base it on. And then when you come back to actually build it, you square up. If there's a long delay in that and people are going through the program, they're operating under one exaction fee, but then the number changes later on, so that the quicker that can happen, the less chance of inequities in the program. A couple more from the internal stakeholders. Parks and open space is kind of the last element to be implemented, and that obviously that upsets or changes the calculation. In general, regional infrastructure plans are generally preferred over just kind of tacking on type thing. It kind of leads to a better aesthetic for the community, so that was one of the feedback we heard. As well as we heard LFCCG on the sanitary side of things, they'd rather build the infrastructure themselves, the wastewater improvements. That way they can kind of control the quality and kind of make sure it fits within their grand plan. But on the stormwater transportation side, they're really not equipped to do that. So they actually like that the developers are doing that. And then any new, this is a strong theme we've heard from everybody, any new approach should have a clear path to dissolve the program, so we're not back here 20 years from now. And so I'm going to hand it over to Ed Holmes with EHI. He's going to he led the external stakeholder, and he'll go over kind of the responses we heard from that. Ed, if you've learned nothing today, don't get anywhere near that podium or it'll go off.
Which way?
Advance, back, and the laser pointer's the red.
All right, thanks, Joe. As Joe said, I'm Ed Holmes with EHI Consultants, and we were working with Stantec to develop that external stakeholder engagement process. And that included meeting with all the property owners, developers, and their representatives within the expansion areas 1, 2A, 2B, 2C, and 3. And what we were able to quantify out of the process was there were about 10 to 11 property owners that we were able to meet with, and there were some smaller property owners that weren't directly involved with the development, but we also had an opportunity to talk with them and get some of their input as well. The majority of the responses, there were maybe 50 to 60 overall responses, but the themes that we were seeing coming out of the responses were they felt that about 95% of those responses said that the stakeholders felt they have overpaid for their exaction credits. We heard that quite often within this process and during the time of engaging the program. And we heard that this is supposed to be a zero-sum game, and that was the theme that was woven throughout this. So majority of responses were talking about the overpayment of exaction credits, and the tables were not updated regularly. And I think Joe alluded to that from the internal stakeholders. So there was some overlap, what we were hearing from the internal stakeholders within government to the external stakeholders that we were interviewing and speaking with. The theme of records not being kept accurately, that was a theme that was flowing through quite often from all our respondents that we talked with. And that's, a change in administrations, there's change in the people that were working, but they felt that they just wanted accurate records. And how do we come up with some way to keep those accurate? So 95% of our overall responses, these were the themes that we were seeing woven throughout the engagement process. The next tier of responses that we heard from our stakeholders was that the exaction fees have been impacted by the uncertainty surrounding the treatment of the conservation easement. Conservation easements was a big concern. How are those going to be treated? And how does the exaction fees impact those conservation easements? The program is frequently delayed, or there's been a direct cost or canceling development in some of the expansion areas. Delays have led to cancellation of developments, which have also created some problems for the deployment of infrastructure. The program obviously lacks clarity. We've heard that several times on who is responsible for constructing the infrastructure, who's going to pay for it, and how's that going to be calculated into the program overall. So those are sort of in between the 75 to 80% of the responses came from those areas. The low responses was the program is a deterrent to developing smaller lots. We've heard that a medium to low amount of times that the program just doesn't encourage small lot developments, many of which comprise the existing vacant available land. So there was a theme there, wasn't as great as the others, but how can the program incent or encourage development of smaller lots is something that we felt was needed. Then the other response, which wasn't quite as significant, but it's about as significant to the people that expressed it, but it had a low response rate. Marketing of the program for new development is lacking or adds a prohibitive cost towards the end of the development approval process. So how do we market this without increasing the cost? We heard that a couple times. And then capital infrastructure projects have been less effective for what was paid. And then, for example, the sewers were being subpar in terms of one area primarily where there wasn't enough gravity flow for the sewer construction. So we heard that was probably our lowest response on the external stakeholders. But as Joe said, there's some overlap with what we've heard internally to the ones that we had externally. It was a total of 10 property owners, developers, and their representatives that we talked with. And then we had a couple individual private property owners that we were able to meet with and get their input as well. So, Joe, I'll turn it back over to you, and then we'll take questions afterwards, I guess.
Yeah, we're very close. We only got a few more slides.
Give you this.
Oh yeah, that might help. So as you've heard the feedback, you've heard what we we kind of draw on conclusions from just looking at the records and whatnot. And so as we we've seen a lot of criticisms of the program, but the program has been very effective at allowing those areas to develop and get that infrastructure built. So I don't want anybody to lose sight of that. But it is time to kind of see how we can tweak it and come up with a strategy to kind of get us across that finish line. Again, we didn't hear from any of the feedback that anybody was really in love with the current program, and I don't think anybody's going to be really sad if it morphs into or at least it sunsets, I should say. But so as we kind of take all this feedback and try to come up with a way to kind of equitably get us through this, we're going to run into situations you can almost predict it that there's going to be decisions that we're going to consider, like we could go left or we could go right. Well, you can't go both simultaneously. So when we run into those things, we have to, how are we going to make those decisions? And again, these are decisions just for our recommendations. This isn't ink on Mylar in an ordinance or anything like that. So we're going to do something we call it guiding principles. And so when we're evaluating left or right, we're going to look at certain things and how we're going to judge which one makes the most sense. It's primarily for these mutually exclusive alternatives, and that way we make sure that we're not tweaking something and not all change is good. We make it worse, and then also you guys understand why we went the direction we went. What was the basis for us making some of those decisions and our recommendations? And we use this process when we developed the capacity assurance program for Lexington, and it worked out fairly well. So we're going to kind of continue it for this. So let's talk about what those guiding principles are. So what we're going to do when we run into these decisions to be made as far as do we go left or right, the first thing we're going to do is, if option A or option B, what's the impact on the cost or the effort to administer the solution? The last thing we want to do is, hey, here's how we're going to tweak it, and you only have to hire 400 new people to help administer it. You don't want that. And then the same token, we don't want to create something that's just unfair to the stakeholders in the community that are participating in this program. So we're trying to look at that impact. Transparency, we want everybody to be able to see what you can see and know that it's not being done kind of behind closed doors and smoke-filled rooms. But and then also one of the things we like to see is if it's easy to understand and communicate. If everybody understands it, it makes it so much easier. And so that's kind of what we're going to use as our guiding principles when we evaluate these competing solutions. There may be others. We think we've captured the majority of them, but if you guys, and we get into the Q&A, if you guys have some ideas like, hey, we'd also like you to consider this, by all means, let us know. So again, we're right on the cusp of Task 3. We haven't started anything, but as we've it's almost impossible to look at all this feedback and not start getting your brain thinking about some things you want to explore a little further. And so that's what we've done here is kind of a teaser. Again, there'll be other things we consider and stuff, but these are the ones that kind of struck us is, looking at the expansion areas, we don't think we're going to be able to find a way to get one size fits all. They're just too different from one another. So we think there'll probably be a separate solution for each of the expansion areas. They'll have a lot of commonalities, but there might be some slight tweaks for each, just depending on, if you look at expansion area 2, it's mostly developed, right? Whereas expansion area 1 is essentially a blank canvas. Expansion area 1 has one property owner, right? The other expansion areas have multiple property owners. The other thing we think is we're going to probably give some thought to these trigger events. Part of what happened in the program is as some of these changes happened and it would trigger the exactions calculations to be done, there wasn't hey, we need to pause, reset, and really square things up, or else we're going to get too far out of whack. So we want to kind of define what those trigger events are, so that way it's a reminder. If one of these things happens, this is a pause. So we're going to kind of explore what that would look like. Same thing as LGCG said, hey, we'd like to kind of do our own wastewater infrastructure if we can. So we'll look to see what that would look like and how that would work, as well as we heard and Frank had told you is, there's not been a whole lot of transparency. Our numbers don't match your numbers kind of stuff. So we're going to see what are some options for allowing that ledger to be seen by all. And I don't mean Barlow Holmes can see Ball Holmes. I mean, Ball Holmes can see their ledger, Barlow can see their ledger type thing. But that way, you could see that, and that way, if the numbers aren't adding up, you can find out immediately as opposed to and get those rectified or resolved, versus waiting every so often to when you have a meeting and realize that you guys are apples and oranges. So some of those are some of the things we're looking at. Again, there'll be others, but again, we're trying to navigate a path through here to find a way we can get us across the finish line and kind of avoid some of these issues that have happened in the past. And so that's kind of it. We didn't want to go an hour and a half. If you listen to me and Ed talk, we wanted to kind of give you a progress update where we're at, and then open it up to questions and feedback. Again, we've met with everybody now, but I'm as guilty as anybody is. Somebody asks me a question, we have a discussion, and then the next night on the drive home or something, I'm thinking, oh, I forgot about this, or I never thought about this, and I get another thought. So we want to give everybody a second bite at the apple, so to speak, to be able to say, hey, and now that you've heard what other people's feedback, what your reaction to that is, and just we heard a lot of things we didn't like about the program, and I know on the calls I participated with, we were asking, hey, what would you like to see in the new program? And there weren't a whole lot of suggestions. So, I mean, we can come up with something, but if you guys have ideas, we certainly would like to hear what you have to say, because ultimately you guys are going to have to live with this program. So we certainly want to consider what you think might work and we'll evaluate it. So after that, open it up to questions. I will caution, we have one of our members of our team is not local, so he's on the phone. He's on a speaker right next to the microphone, so he can hear he's hearing what we're saying. But he's our financial wizard, so if you have deep, dark financial general questions, we don't want to dive into anybody's particular situation, but if you have general financial questions, I'll just repeat the question, and he can answer. So I'm an engineer, not a financial wizard. Charlie, you're pointing at somebody with a question. Okay. Jim.
Joe, you all mentioned at the very beginning this is not a typical program.
Right.
You found you were looking at other communities, and you cite examples of privilege fees and impact fees.
Yep.
Do you know what our option is for going in that direction?
We are still looking into that. My understanding is there are some communities in Kentucky that have impact fees, but I'm not quite. I know we had talked to Michael Craven, and it's a little bit. The rumor is that they're not legal, but it either is or it isn't. There's no, we think it is. So we need to look into that a little closer. But it may also be they're calling it impact fees, but it's just a surrogate name for something else, or they may be a different type, like a municipality versus an MSD type situation, a regional utility. So we got to look into that a little further. But that's part of when we task 3. We need to look at that and say, does this look like a promising option? And if it does, what would need to happen to make that happen, right? Is that getting a state law change? That's going to be a lot of work. Or is it, no, it's possible. It's just, everybody, we run into this all the time where everybody just assumes, oh, we can't do that. That'd be cost prohibitive. And you say, well, how much would it cost? And how do you know it's cost prohibitive? You've never calculated the cost. We've run into that before too, and that's what we're wondering if this impact fee is it really illegal, or is it everybody just assumed it was and nobody ever took a deeper dive? So, but we'll work with law to figure out I'm not a lawyer either, but we'll figure it out. So, all right, you're not updating the comp plan anytime soon, are you?
We're starting
Okay,
now,
okay.
So hold on to your hat.
Okay. All right. Yes.
Building on Jim's question, when you were looking at those other communities, were there other, when you looked at other local governments in Kentucky or elsewhere, were there programs that you would call more successful than others, and what did those look like?
Well, we haven't, that's what we're gonna do in task 3. We haven't dived into those yet, so we've just done like Frank is actually, had most of his experiences in Florida, and he says that's the norm down there. Everybody does impact fees. I know Craig came from there, and he says the same thing. We've not polled Kentucky. We've just done like a thumbnail to say, well, these folks are saying they're doing impact fees, but we have not dove in to see what, is it really truly an impact fee? And if it is, are they doing it and just haven't got caught, or are they a different animal and they come in through loophole number 5 or whatever? So that's a task that we have yet to do. Yes?
Talk to us a little bit about the process going through 3.
Okay.
In terms of feedback to the property owners and stakeholders, external stakeholders.
Okay, sure.
In terms of issues, begin to hone in on solutions, what's the process for having some interaction?
Right, and so I'll give you a little bit of the process, and then I'll let Craig jump in, because they're gonna dictate a lot of that after we're done types thing. So our goal is, now that we've gotten the feedback, is to, our team will kind of sequester ourselves and figure out, throw some ideas out, and we might reach out to certain folks just to get a little bit of feedback if we need more clarification on something like legal or something like that. And then we would put together a report, and we're envisioning, and now, again, we haven't done it, so I'm gonna speak theoretically. So let's say we end up with a separate strategy for each of the expansion areas, right? We may run into a situation where, this strategy would work, this one would too. This strategy for, let's just say expansion area 2, this one would work, but the pros and cons, it has this advantages and this disadvantages. You could do this strategy, it would answer the mail, but it has different pros and cons, and it's really just a preference thing. So we might have that, and then we would vet with maybe internal or external stakeholders just to clarify stuff, but not really get their blessing or anything like that. Then we would go to Craig and say, okay, before you submit to the council or whatever you're gonna do, because ours is just a report with recommendations, right? It's not a legally binding document. They could easily grab it, throw it in the trash, or they could submit it to council to get them to endorse it, and it becomes the basis for an ordinance later. That's really more of a Craig thing, so I'm gonna hand you, oh, you don't want it? Okay. Okay.
So that's a great start to it. What we're looking at doing is then 2 to 3 months, when we have a report to share, we will convene another meeting of this committee and invite all of you again. And so we would be looking to receive your input on that as well. We would try to get that report out to you in advance of that meeting, so that it's not the first time you're hearing anything about it when you get into the room, so that you have a chance to review it and discuss it. But really, our goal would be to have some type of consensus through this process before we move this on to council, so that we can get something done and implemented.
Craig, that's kind of what I'm getting at, is, once you go to the report format, 90% down the road, it's difficult to, how are you gonna get particularly the external stakeholders who are paying the bills, how are you gonna get them with a consensus?
Sure. Well, the report's not going to provide a conclusion. It's going to provide options for discussion, and that's why we would convene this committee again and advertise the meeting and ask the stakeholders to participate as well. And we would be looking to you all to provide that input to get us towards a solution that's most equitable for everybody. So it is a final report in that it's going to lay out the options that the team has been able to identify, but it's really, as I understand it, and Joe, let me know if I'm misspeaking here, but I understand it to be more like a menu for us to consider, and then we can discuss it from there. Anyone of you?
I represent Paul. And I appreciate being invited today. That's good. I appreciate there's going to be a report. Who is the report to?
Well, ultimately, it's to the council, because they'll be making the decision.
People keep talking about a committee. Is there a committee?
Well, this is the front row here. These are the members of the Exaction Credit Advisory Committee. And so typically in the past, this committee has been used for decisions regarding if a developer is building infrastructure. They would review those costs and approve them, before it goes to council for final approval in an ordinance. So we're using the same committee structure for this process as well. So that's what that reference is.
I appreciate that.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Yeah, of course, I'm Dick Murphy, Park Property Business as well. I have some of the same concerns Charlie does. Right now, I think you all need to understand that the property owners don't have anything approaching the full picture of this. We have almost nothing. For example, I'm getting an accounting of my client's accounts and finance. They can get that to me in a couple of weeks, which I understand. I want it to be fully accurate. I don't want it to be rushed. I want to get the full numbers on it. That's fine. But we don't have financial information. And we don't, I think there's been discussion about terminating the program. Obviously, whether owners get refunded money and are comfortable with what's happening is going to be critical to this, because, I mean, we don't just have a moral investment in this, there's a financial investment in this.
Certainly.
People are holding money that comes to people. So I hope that before your report goes too far with conclusion, you'll come back and talk to us, because I think everybody in this room wants to be supportive of what you're doing. Okay, we want to go in and say, yeah, we agree, we buy in, it's a fair way to do it, but we got to get included early on in the process so we can be comfortable being comfortable with what you're doing, okay, on that. The other part is the interim process. As an example, I've got a client that has over 40 acres coming in right now. We're building the infrastructure. We'll have $1.2 million of exaction fees due on that. And, you know, if we're talking about terminating it, client may not be real happy in paying in a bunch of cash. I mean, we'll give credit for some of that, but some of that will be cash coming in. And you know, are you going to hold that cash in an escrow account or something, or what are you going to do in the interim during this time that's going on?
Those are all fair points. Those are issues that we're going to have to address as this moves forward. But just to reiterate, we're not looking to move this forward to council until we have a consensus amongst the property owners. We want to ensure that everybody's on the same page before this moves forward. With regard to the credit statement, I know that, I don't want to speak for finance, but I know that they're working on, we have those numbers, they're just working on pulling together, you know, taking another look at that before it's shared. But we're looking at sharing that in the short term, and in the longer term, if the credits, if in the final analysis we're still using some form of credit, we're looking at making that more available on a regular basis, so developers, so property owners can take a look at that, you know, same day type of information. Yes, sir.
I'd like to follow up on what Richard just said, what Darby just said. You know, I appreciate the fact that you're working on numbers, and we're here to try to find a solution. And we appreciate your involvement, Ed's involvement, that's great. Well, we can't figure out what y'all have done, much less what you're proposing to do. And it's almost an unbelievable story. You know, all our property is in 2C. We entered into 8 contracts with you between December of '01 and April of '06. So 5 years, 20 years ago. And if I'm reading these contracts right, we had bid exaction expenditures of $6.581 billion. Now, we put in the infrastructure, a couple of detention basins, part of 5 detention basins, you know, part of Hayes Boulevard, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we get a letter in October of '17 letter written in October of 17. And it said, we don't have your actuals. And if you don't give us your actuals in 30 days, we're going to penalize you or dock you for 20% of your actual costs. That's, if bid and actual are the same, that's $1.3 billion. And in this contract, Craig, there's a notice provision that says that notices shall be deemed sufficiently given or served if given in writing to a specific person at a specific address. Those letters in October of 17 were not sent to the right address. They were not even sent to the right person. And so I guess it's fair to say that if it's deemed sufficient, if you send it to X and Y, then it's insufficient not to send it to X and Y. Well, we get that letter, okay? Eventually, after the second. The second letter comes like a year later, maybe July of 18. And there's no explanation for their numbers, but they say, here's your exaction amounts under certain contracts. There's no explanation for whether that included a 20% deduct or not. Although one of those contracts, the Richardson contract, is dead on a 20% reduction in the amount of the bid number. So we suspect that it's there, that there's a 20% deduction. Nobody ever gives us a chance to say why you did that, or why you didn't do that, or, you know, they just said, here it is. And oh, by the way, remember the 20% reduction was because the government says, we don't have your actions. I've got pages and pages and pages of correspondence between the Barlows, their lawyers, about these contracts with half a dozen or more people in government. And in the July letter, y'all come up with numbers that you grant exactions on, which means you got the records. And yet you threaten us with taking away 20%, and you apparently do that. And it's a big number. It's a big number. And that's why I say, Craig, that it's not so much what you're going to do here. I mean, in 2C, what, you say that 90% of that's already been dealt, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, the majority definitely is.
Well,
Yeah,
there's
90%.
your number.
Yep.
So
January last year.
there's 10% left. So I'm at least as curious about what's gonna happen but more importantly, what has happened. Now, in July of 2020, John's building 4 apartment complexes over on, what is it, John Hancock? And after, even before you sent the July 18 letter out, which said that we have all these credits, you tell us we have no credits. You change the number 3 months later, and then you demand $330,000 from us in exaction monies. And we don't have a clue where that money went to. You know, you said the sum zero game.
Equity, yeah, I mean, but that's essentially the
I
same
mean,
thing.
so, I mean, that's where we're coming from, and again, I appreciate the fact that you're here, and we're looking for a solution, but we've asked for financials, haven't gotten it.
Help me out here, and again, we're jumping in to understand this program. letter, or maybe you didn't receive that, I don't know.
I know.
Well, either way, I said, now that you are aware of this, have you submitted the actuals, are they incorporated yet, or, I guess what I'm trying to say, is this a past issue, or is this a current issue?
Well, there's $1.3 million
It is just.
in past monies that may or may not be.
Just to clarify, that the original letter that was sent out in 2017, the reason that was submitted is because we hadn't updated the rate table in quite some time. As all of you know, it was a 2010 rate table. And what was really keeping us from updating that rate table is getting actual costs for all of the improvements. Otherwise, the rate table update it'd be inaccurate right away. And so that was the letter that was sent at the beginning. The letter that you had received, and I'm glad we can meet separately, and I'm glad to go over all of this in more detail. I'm more than glad to do that anytime. But the letter you received the last year was the final amount that those agreements were closed out at. And I think they did represent the 20% decrease because we did not receive any response to the letter. So that's what that was. Now that is separate from, and I'm just mentioning this because this might be helpful for everyone. The amount of the closeouts, it just represented what your agreement final amount is. In other words, there's a set amount of exaction credits that were allocated at the end of the day towards each one of those agreements. That is not the same as the number or the actual balance of your credits, because we allowed we allowed through this program that developers would have the ability to spend their credits, essentially, to use their credits, up to 80% of them before closeout, because we didn't want developers to have to wait several years in some cases before those credits are available. And so the balances you heard were that closeout amount less what had actually been used. So I'm not saying to agree with those numbers or disagree, but just by way of explanation, that's why you would have seen one letter that said you have $1 million in credits, for example, but then you received information that said you're actually zeroed out on this. It would be because you've used that $1 million in credits towards your exactions due.
Well, I may need to bring an accountant to look at your documents, but we need your documents before the accountant can give us advice. And so far, we've not gotten any.
But so, just so I understand, if we navigate, we need to understand I know when they were doing the 2020 rate table, they didn't have your actuals, so they just assumed bid was the same as actual and forfeited the 20% of credits, right? But then they used that to the rate tables. Since that time, have you given the actuals and have the rate table been updated?
We gave them to them before that time. And I think I mentioned that Mr. Barlow met with the government, his lawyers, Mr. Turner, Ms. Nauman, and others met with the government. Carol Goes, who worked for us, met with the government. We have communications from all these people.
So all receipts have been submitted, the
to the
actual
government.
costs are known, okay.
That would be very helpful information to us, because I don't
Oh, you don't
have that information.
Well,
So if you have copies of that, we'd be more than
yeah,
glad to take a
I
look.
certainly do.
Okay.
Just not to get
Have you looked for the actuals?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
That was step one, is digging into the past on all of this and finding all of the information that we had available. That's not to say that there's not some information somewhere that I'm unaware of, but and everywhere that I looked, I didn't. Step one is to find those receipts. That would have made life much easier with the rate table update. It would have pushed it along quicker. So, and like I said, the letter you received is because we were, again, trying to put a time frame to those closeouts so we could update the rate table. That was the sole purpose of that.
Is anybody else in the same boat where you don't have the actuals for stuff that's already long since been built?
I think there may have been one one other applicant or developer that we didn't hear back from, and I think it may have been the result of just, I think there was a bankruptcy action on the particular property, so we didn't expect a response, right? We heard from all others.
You know, and I think a number of us said when we met with you individually, you know, we really need to figure out what the numbers are. Yep. Because the numbers, this is not an uncomplicated issue if you have the right numbers, but. Yeah. That's where it lies the problem, and it seems we need to figure out where the holes are.
Sure, that's
Between your numbers and individual numbers.
fair comment.
So we can figure out.
I think we can provide those numbers to you in the interim so that they're not part of that final report.
Ashley Simpson from the Finance Department. We have Phyllis here as well from our accounting division. We are working on closing out our fiscal year right now. As of July 15th, we'll be able to give you those numbers for each agreement. You guys will reach out to Ashley Simpson in Finance or Phyllis Cooper in accounting. We're glad to provide those. So we've spoken with Mr. Murphy and have his request, and we'll be getting those. But if any of you others have pending requests that we're unaware of, we'd be glad to work with you and get you those balances after July 15th.
If it'd be helpful, I can send out to the same stakeholder list that was invited to the meeting today. I'll provide Ashley's contact information to that, and that way you have it. All right, other questions or comments?
Given this situation, and if you can't find what we gave you before, can we resubmit it to get a proper credit on a go-forward?
I can't give you an answer to that today. That's something I would have to discuss, likely with the CAO's office, to find out procedure on that, because the rate table has been updated based on the numbers, so we would have to work through that with the CAO's office as well as law.
CAO.
I'm sorry, the Chief Administrative Officer.
Okay, thank you. Well, will you find out?
Yes, sir.
Let us
Yeah.
know, that'd be wonderful.
Sure, glad to.
I'm not so sure that the rate tables make any difference. I mean, again, assuming it's a zero-sum game. And we get the number, you get the right numbers, they gonna have some adjustments. The rate table may be adjusted going forward, but the past rate tables really don't matter.
Well, and moving forward, the hope is that we're no longer talking about rate tables, so it's a kind of two separate issues, as you know. The first is reconciling up to this point, and then coming up with a solution at this point forward.
Well, again, as you can see, there's a lot of uncertainty, and.
Yes, sir.
And as heard all of us say, keep us in the loop early, so we can keep talking and try to find the solution, because as Dick said, we won't be here to help. I mean, we'll get this solved and
Sure.
get this resolved.
And that's the intent of this process, is to bring this group back together for those discussions.
Again, task one was largely, our own self-study. You all participated in task two, this is the end of task two. We haven't even started talking about solutions, that's part of us. We wanted to get your feedback, let you know what's going on, so we're not just calling you one day, say, hey, we've got a bunch of solutions, you need to come to a meeting next week, that way
That's why
this is
we'll-
probably a little bit of an early meeting, because you're just getting a progress update, but we're not really ready to unveil any possible recommendations, so this is just a heads up.
I guess our point is that task two, stakeholder engagement, can't really be completed until we have enough information to feel like we're fully engaged, okay?
As far as your particular balance and stuff, yeah, for sure. But we wanted to understand, when we come up with a way to get across the finish line, or a strategy or solution, whatever you want to call it, a different approach, we need to understand not specific $1.3 million. We need to know what are some of the tripping points in the current program, like, hey, nobody gets to see what the ledger is and nobody's numbers match, right? Well, so now we say, okay, that needs to be it. I don't need to know what the clients you represent, what your particular balances are. When the rectification comes, that information is extremely valuable, obviously. But we just need to know, okay, whatever strategy, there needs to be some way that everybody can see their own ledger, and that we're not exchanging letters back and forth. So that way they don't find out till months later that their numbers don't match, something like that. So that way, if they are starting to deviate, it can be quickly resolved.
Yeah, you just reminded me of something, as well. You said earlier that, you know, if somebody see anybody else's ledger.
Well, yeah, you don't have to share private information.
Well, I don't know that it's private information. I
Right.
mean, how do we reconcile without seeing that our ledger relates to the total ledger of a particular area and who's paid what? How do we get through that without that information?
Yeah, and I'm not 100% sure, because what you don't want to do is give away anybody's private information, but you're right, you can't, if you don't know that all the sum equals 0, then you're not, how are you convinced you didn't get a rough, or a raw deal? I'm with you. And that's part of the stuff we're gonna work out in test. How do we do that without sharing everybody's ATM PIN numbers and stuff like that, you know? Not that anybody, you know, everybody's ATM PIN numbers.
Not that it has to go that deep, but
Yeah, sure. Just out of curiosity, what is your PIN number? Okay, no.
There's one other aspect we'd like to bring up to you.
Sure.
is That, for instance, I represent the Clark family, Ralph, Rochelle, and I represent the Clark family.
Okay.
I'm the attorney, he's the manager.
Okay.
And in the course of development of that, we've set aside a lot of land for greenways, walkways, and that sort of thing, which otherwise would have been developed into lots. And the reward, so to speak, was that we'd get credit for this, and this would be sort of banked for us as an exaction credit. And I want you to be sensitive that if you take away the reward, if you will, to bank the money that's supposedly there, that affects what we've been doing with the understanding that we would get that reward for it. We've proceeded that way for 20 years and done the parts of the expansion plan do say, okay, you set aside this land, and they also set aside, say, you'll get a reward, so to speak, for that, and then you get credit for it. I'm not sure it's a reward, it's just credit for what we're doing. So as you dismantle the exaction fee program, you're also impacting what's gone into the land use program, which is the expansion area master plan as well. You can't do that in isolation. You need to look at the impacts that's going to have on the expansion plan as well.
Yeah, I guess the goal is not to, hey, those were the old rules, these are the new rules, and everybody gets the carpet pulled out from underneath. That's not, I mean, there's no way you can dismantle the old program without kind of reconciling or making everybody whole. I mean, otherwise nobody can accept it, right? That's part of the reason we're gonna go sequester ourselves, come up based on the feedback, figure out what, and then come back to you guys to see it and say, hey, you know, we only know what we know and what you've told us, but there may be something, we designed something that has some unintended consequence that we are not aware of, but you are hey, you overlooked the fact that we were promised this, or in page 25 of our agreement it says this, and this ignores that. That's part of that process, because the goal here is not to see, you know, to pick winners and losers here. The goal here is how do we navigate those so that we can get this infrastructure built, and we can not be saddled with some of the challenges we've had before with ledgers or with infrastructure costs and zoning changing and radically changing the rate tables, and they're not current. You know, that's kind of the goal here. It's not to, you know, hey, let's see if we can pull a fast one on so and so. That's not the goal here. So.
In other words, the owners, developers in a particular area get together and say, here's what we think.
That's certainly, we've discussed that internally, if that's, because that's done in other areas, that's certainly a solution. But again, before we, you know, we have ideas, but we haven't really vetted them, because then you run into the situations of, okay, what happens if there's a disagreement with two of the private, and how does it get resolved? You know, we get infrastructure that goes to nowhere, right? That kind of thing. So those are some of the things we would look at to say, okay, you know, and how, what's LFUCG's role in there? They just, you just submit, you know, it's those such things we have to ferret out the details, so that way we don't want to, last thing you want to do is say, hey, this program had a bunch of challenges, and so we've tweaked it like this, and now we have a whole new set of challenges that are even worse, right, you know?
You have to have a series of much smaller meetings with each specific area.
Yeah.
When you get down into this level, down into the level of detail you're talking about.
Right, but we don't want to come to that meeting until we've kind of got a framework for a solution we're considering, and then let you guys kick the tires. Because otherwise, if we have those meetings now, here's a great example. Okay, what's the best movie of all time? That's a tough question to answer, right? But if I told you, out of these 3 movies, which one's the best, it's a much easier way to answer that question, right? So that, we didn't want to come with a blank slate and say, what do you think, right? I mean, everybody's staring at a blank screen.
I'm just suggesting that I'm meeting collectively like this.
Yeah, this is the whole purpose of this meeting is, you know what you told us, they know what they told us, they know what they told us, but you don't know what they told, so this is just, in the spirit of transparency, let everybody hear some of them you'll care about, like, oh, that doesn't affect me, some of them you'll be like, oh yeah, that's my issue too. And that's part of the way we wanted to share with the internal stakeholders, and you can kind of see what, from their side, some of the challenges they've had, but also the way Frank grouped them is, these are the most common, almost everybody told us this, others just told us this, and this was a little less popular, but it was still an issue, but that way, everybody gets the benefit of hearing what everybody else had to say, as opposed to, sequestering, it's like the police do, right? Two accomplices in 2 separate interrogation rooms, and they never know what each other's telling. So that's kind of the deal, is to get everybody around so they can hear. All right. Other questions? How are we doing on time? Oh, we're not too bad.
Great on time.
Yeah. You ready to take this hot potato from me?
Hopefully it doesn't blow the speakers here. There you go. I'll stay away from the speakers there. Well, thank you again, everybody, for your time. If you have questions or thoughts after the meeting today, please email me any information you have or any questions you'd like answered, and I can share those with the team that's looking at this and working on the study. As I said, we are looking at 2 to 3 months before we're completed with some kind of framework we can share. I know we're going to be bringing this group back together to share that information and get some consensus and some discussion. You had a fair comment that we're going to probably need some smaller breakout groups before we even get to that point, or maybe after. We're just going to have to see what the recommendations are in there and what it looks like. But we're sensitive to that the different areas are unique, and we're going to have some separate discussions on that as well. So we will continue to be in touch. We have that email group that we used for this meeting, and we'll continue to provide updates by email as well as for future meetings. So thank you again, everybody.
One last thing is, and I think somebody over here alluded to something. We've heard the feedback, and we're going to start thinking, if one of you know that you're going to make some radical change, like, Overwood Farm's going to sell their property to 5 different people, and it goes from 1 player to 5 players. If there's some major change that, without breaching anybody's confidentiality or anything, that you're willing to share, that may affect what we're doing here, by all means, let Craig know, so that way we can anticipate that. Last thing we'll do is come up with strategy, and then everything completely changes from the conditions that we were operating under. So if you know if there's some major